If your home is anything like mine, then you've probably got a cupboard somewhere that's got old games consoles stored away never to be used again. But I actually think that we could be using these things for some interesting photography subjects. Stick around and I'll explain more in just a sec. Hi guys, I'm Ben from Adaptalux and welcome back to another photography tutorial where today we're getting pretty retro. I think all of this retro stuff has come back around with the likes of Stranger Things and Dungeons and Dragons being really popular. So I've been rooting around in my home to try and find some retro objects to photograph and try and recreate some of those nostalgic vibes in my photography. I'm going to be doing this with a lot of lighting techniques, but also we need a retro object to photograph it in the first place because it's very hard to recreate that old style of making things where the plastics were different, the styling was different, and just generally everything had a lot more switches and dials and knobs than all of the things that you get today. So if we were to take our PlayStation 5 and put it next to the Binatone TV game, one of them is certainly going to look a lot more retro. In fact, this particular games console, I suppose you could call it a games console still, came out in 1977, so almost 50 years ago, but that gives it some really epic retro vibes. You've got a nice little, I think that's a speaker in the front there, or perhaps it's simply just some decoration. It's really hard to tell, but we've got all of these lovely dials, knobs, buttons, sliders. There's little tiny controllers with dials on them as well. All of this was to run essentially variations of Pong. There's not a lot to it. I can't plug it into my TV. It doesn't work anymore with modern TVs, but it did come with some really interesting accessories, including this equally retro light gun. All of this is going to make for our photography subject today, but I'm not just going to photograph the entire thing. Of course, we focus on macro photography here on the channel, so I'm going to get up close to some of the features, some of those switches, the dials, some of the detail on the plastic, and see if I can't highlight some of those interesting retro features using a retro style of photography. Now, I'm going to be using some extra lighting, but otherwise you can be using whatever camera and whatever lens you want. You can even try and do this with some retro camera equipment if you want. Perhaps a really old lens would add to the effect. For now, I'm going to grab my fairly modern lens and modern camera and modern lighting and set up my first shot. So then guys, as you can see, I've set my camera down on a tripod and on my focus stacking rail because I want to do a bit of focus stacking today and get lots of detail out of this this lovely little games console, which you can see that I've placed down on the table here. I'm just going to be moving it around on the table, placing it where it needs to be, and refocusing my camera on various aspects of this, well, it's an interestingly retro device, really. I really like all of these different symbols. It's very reminiscent of the 80s and 70s. You can see that the box here has seen better days, so we're not going to be taking any photos of that, but I think there's plenty of interesting details and features on the console itself, and of course all of those controllers and things as well, which we will take a look at. But the photo itself is looking pretty plain at the moment, simply because just using the ambient light in the room, and there's some video lights on as well, so that's where those reflections are coming from. But we'll be turning all of that out, and we're going to be adding some lights to this scene to make it look a lot more retro. Of course, the lights that we're going to be using are going to be colored, and they're going to be from the Adaptalux Studio. So if you've never seen the Adaptalux Studio before, it is a dedicated macro light source. We've got a control pod here which provides all the power. We've got a mini tripod for it to stand on and stand on our table. And then we have these flexible lighting arms which allow us to place light exactly where we need it in our scene. Now you can see that I've got a red light and a blue light plugged in here, and that's because I want to use red and blue to add some retro vibes to my games console. I've also got some white lights, and we can also diffuse these as well simply by magnetizing diffusers onto the ends of the lighting arms. It's really very simple to build a lighting setup like this. Now these are LED lights as well, so it means that they're on all of the time, which is really handy when you don't know exactly how you want your light to look. It means that you can place your lights into your scene as you're looking at the back of the camera and see exactly what your photo is going to look like before you hit the shutter button. That's exactly what I'm going to do now. I'm going to place these lights down on my scene here and see if I can't find a nice, pleasing placement of my lights that accentuates some of the retro features on my Binatone. So let's build a little lighting setup for our shot just here. You can see that it looks, well, pretty dull from where we're looking right now, but I want to add some lights in from different directions. I do have a pretty good idea of what I want this to look like in my head, but it's going to take a bit of experimentation with the placement of my lights to get it right. I'm going to start off with the red lighting arm here, and I'm just going to plug that in, and then I'm going to try and place that in this bottom right hand corner of the image. I want a little bit of red coming from the right and perhaps a little bit of blue over here somewhere. Now, as I'm taking a look at my light, you can actually see that there is a shadow being created by this little sliding switch just here. So I want to be very conscious of where that shadow is. I don't want it to be too distracting. I want this to be a nice, soft looking red light coming from this side. So I don't think we're going to be able to eliminate it entirely if we want the red to really show up, but that looks like a pretty good position for my red. Now from the other direction I want to bring in some blue, so let's add a blue lighting arm and place that so it's on the opposite side. Now once again, now that we've added another light source, we now have a blue shadow down here in the red. So again, we want to be very conscious of how these two lights are interacting with each other. I'm going to try and find the area where the Binatone brown plastic is going to reflect some of this blue quite nicely, and that looks to be around there. So that is going to be a pretty good position for my blue light. You can also see that it's quite limited to where that reflection is going to touch, so the blue light isn't quite reaching over to this little switch, and therefore it's not creating a shadow there. Now there's one last thing missing here. I think this top side over here looks quite dark, so I'm going to add just a white lighting arm to add a little bit of white light into this scene as well. We can find that reflection point again just by placing a diffused white light in the area where it's going to reflect off this plastic, and I think that makes for quite a nice little scene. So I've done a little bit more fine tuning and changed the settings on my camera. Because we added light to our image, it means obviously we need to change the settings on our camera. So I've just changed my ISO to ISO 400, we're on 1/100th of a second, and f2.8. Now f2.8 leaves us with a very shallow depth of field. As you can see here, as I move the focus, we're actually really focused on only maybe a couple of millimeters along the plane along just here. So what I'd ideally like to do is close down my aperture a little bit and get some wider depth of field. Now we can do that using a feature of the control pod. Because we've only just plugged these lights in, they just default to 50% brightness, and they're going to stay at 50% brightness. However, there is a feature called boost mode that allows us to increase the brightness of all of our arms at the same time. So without changing the level of each individual arm, we can just hold the dial on the top of the pod here, and everything's going to get much brighter. That's a really important feature to know about on the control pod, because although it reduces your battery life, it's really handy for getting much better settings when you are ready to shoot. So I recommend turning that on when you're ready to take your photograph and adjusting your settings accordingly. We can now go up to, say, well, f8 and ISO 500 just to compensate, and then 1/100th of a second, and that gives us a much wider depth of field, which is more appropriate for an item of this size. So I need to decide where I actually want this little slider to be. I think that is actually a good position. I'm not sure if I like it all the way at the bottom or perhaps halfway there. I think I'll take both, but right now it's time to focus stack. I want to get all of this entire image in focus, and the way I'm going to do that is by taking images as I move my plane of focus through my shot. I'm then going to put them into a piece of software called Helicon Focus, and it's going to stack all of the images together, taking only the sharpest point from each image. That will leave us with one photograph with everything in focus. Let's give it a go. So I think adding some blue and red light to our images here has created a sufficiently retro looking aesthetic that matches the aesthetic of the games console and all of the features on it. They all look quite retro and appropriate for the era, and I think that red and blue light also looks quite appropriate. Obviously we're looking through modern eyes at this, and we've got the context of sort of Blade Runner and even Stranger Things, using these colors to evoke certain feelings and making them a prevalent part of their cinematography. So that's a very important aspect to think about, is how do people associate the past with the photographs that they're taking now. So if we want to recreate what things looked like in the past, perhaps you wouldn't even use these colors, but if you want to create the feeling of the past, then you can absolutely introduce some modern elements to your images that just evoke those feelings of, well, retroness. Now I'm going to run this theme all the way through a full set of images. I want to focus on various parts of the binatone, the various switches, the design, and some of the interesting retro features, but all with that same red and blue aesthetic to tie everything together. It's going to be a pretty simple shoot from now on, because we've decided on where we want our lights to be placed and what kind of colors and what kind of balance we're going for. So it's just a case of replicating that same process for various different compositions. I'm going to go ahead and make multiple focus stacks, and we'll take a look at the full set of images. I'd usually recommend using these colors quite liberally to begin with. You can always dial them back and find the right balance between seeing the object for its true self with a little bit of white light and then adding those vibes using the colors. Usually people don't notice these things when they're looking at a photograph. They'd have to be analyzing what colors are coming from where and really thinking about how the photograph was taken, rather than just absorbing the image for what it is. So don't be too hesitant to use too much color. Try it out, see how it feels, and you can always dial it back by using the controls on the control pod to individually change the brightness of each of these lights. It's a really fun little shoot to get something like this out of the cupboard and just try and recreate a certain vibe by using different lighting, different compositions, and focusing in on the specific aspects of the object you're shooting. Perhaps it's not even a games console, perhaps it's not even retro. You can still use these techniques of adding some color to create certain feelings. Perhaps some greens and blues to create a more underwater vibe for some seashells. Maybe reds and ambers to create a more homely vibe for something that you might find next to the fire. You really have to just experiment, and there's nothing better than LED lights for trying things out and seeing how your image looks as you're composing things and creating your lighting setup. I'd like to know from you guys what you think to today's shoot and to my images. Let me know down in the comments if they give you sufficiently retro vibes, or perhaps you were there in the 70s and you had one of these consoles. Let me know down below. Make sure to hit the like button as well if you found anything in this video useful, and hit the subscribe button for lots more macro photography tutorials, ideas and inspiration coming in the future. For now, that is all I've got time for. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.